Don't cook anymore, Mom. It's safer. Those 6 words shattered 43 years of love served on ceramic plates. Today, I'm going to tell you something I never thought I'd share. And if you, for even a second, feel like this sounds familiar, just please leave a like and subscribe. It'll help me keep finding the courage to speak these truths. I had just finished peeling potatoes when my son Nathan walked into my kitchen that Tuesday afternoon. My hands, weathered but still steady, moved with the practiced rhythm I'd developed over 4 decades of feeding a family that somehow forgot to count the cost of my devotion. Slice, turn, rinse. The same motion I'd performed thousands of times in this very spot, standing on the faded linoleum that bore the ghost marks of countless spilled meals and hurried cleanups. The soft blue apron tied around my waist still carried the faint scent of yesterday's bread, the kind of smell that should have made him smile, should have reminded him of Saturday mornings when he was 8, and would climb onto the counter to steal cookie dough from the mixing bowl. But today, Nathan didn't inhale deeply like he used to. He didn't comment on the pot of beef stew simmering on the back burner, filling the house with the rich aroma of home. He just stood there in my doorway, shifting his weight from foot to foot, looking everywhere except at my face. The kitchen had always been my sanctuary. These walls had witnessed birthday cakes decorated with trembling hands and late-night worry when fevers spiked and only homemade chicken soup would do. The scratched wooden countertops told stories of Christmas cookie marathons and Easter ham preparations, of packed lunches made with love notes tucked inside brown paper bags. This room held the memory of my husband's morning coffee ritual, 2 sugars, no cream, and the quiet conversations we'd shared over dinner plates that somehow made even the hardest days bearable. But something felt different today. Nathan's usual warmth had been replaced by an uncomfortable distance, like he was delivering news he'd rehearsed in his car before walking to my front door. His expensive suit, the kind his father never could have afforded, seemed out of place in my modest kitchen with its cheerful yellow walls and hand-painted ceramic canisters I'd collected over the years. "Tanya's worried," he continued, his voice carrying that careful tone adults use when they're trying to manage an elderly relative they've decided can no longer manage themselves. "You know, the stove, the oil, your memory. We think it's best if you stop cooking." The words hung in the air like smoke from something burning. I felt my grip tighten on the potato peeler, its familiar weight suddenly foreign in my palm. My memory? The accusation hit harder than if he'd slapped me across the face. Yes, I'd left the kettle on last month, once for maybe 10 minutes while I answered the phone. Nothing had happened. No fire, no disaster, just steam that had already stopped by the time I remembered and turned off the burner. My memory? I asked softly, setting down the peeler with deliberate care. The carrot I'd been preparing rolled slightly on the cutting board, coming to rest against the neat pile of diced onions I'd already finished. Nathan sighed, a sound that seemed to carry the weight of a decision already made without my input. "You've been forgetful, Mom. Tanya noticed. We're just worried about you hurting yourself." That evening, nobody stayed for dinner. Nathan left after delivering his verdict, claiming he had an important client call. Tanya arrived precisely at 6:15 to collect my grandchildren, Emma, age 7, and little Michael, who'd just turned 4, waving at me from the driver's seat like I was a neighbor she barely knew, rather than the grandmother who'd rocked them to sleep during countless babysitting nights when their parents needed time alone. I wrapped the untouched beef stew into small containers, my movements mechanical and precise. Each portion got labeled with masking tape, and my careful handwriting. Monday, Tuesday, Wednesday. Into the freezer they went, joining the growing collection of meals that would never be shared, love that would never be received. The silence in my house that night felt different from the comfortable quiet I'd grown accustomed to since my husband's death 3 years ago. This wasn't the peaceful stillness of a woman content with her own company. This was the hollow echo of a space that had been stripped of its purpose. A kitchen that had been declared too dangerous for the woman who'd spent her entire adult life proving her competence within its walls. I found myself standing at the kitchen window, looking out at the backyard where I'd grown tomatoes and herbs every summer, where my grandchildren had played on the swing set Nathan's father had built with his own hands. The roses I'd planted along the fence were blooming now, pink and white petals that would soon fall to the ground with no one to appreciate their brief beauty. Was this how it began, I wondered? This slow erosion of identity, this gradual removal of the things that defined who I was? First the cooking, then what? Would they decide I was too old to drive, too forgetful to manage my own finances, too fragile to live alone in the house I'd called home for 38 years? I untied my apron, the one with faded embroidery that read, "Mom's Kitchen, love served daily," and hung it on the hook beside the stove. The fabric felt heavier than usual, weighted with the knowledge that it might never serve its purpose again. In the growing darkness of my kitchen, surrounded by the tools and memories of a lifetime spent nourishing others, I began to understand that something precious had been taken from me without my consent. And for the first time in 43 years of motherhood, I started to wonder, was I being protected, or was I being erased? The following morning, I found myself sitting at my kitchen table with a cup of coffee that had long since grown cold, staring at a photograph I'd pulled from the drawer, where I kept my most precious memories. It was Nathan's college graduation day, him in his cap and gown, me beaming beside him in the navy dress I'd saved for months to buy. Behind us, barely visible in the background, sat my old Honda Civic with the dented bumper I'd never been able to afford to fix. I remembered that day so clearly. How proud I'd felt, how I'd told everyone who would listen that my son was the first in our family to graduate college. What I didn't tell them was how I'd worked double shifts at the diner for 3 years to pay his tuition, or how I'd eaten peanut butter sandwiches for dinner more nights than I cared to count, so he could focus on his studies instead of worrying about student loans. The photograph trembled in my hands as I thought about all the other sacrifices that had led to this moment. When Nathan was 12 and desperately wanted to join the travel baseball team, I'd sold my mother's wedding ring, the only piece of jewelry I owned with any value, to pay for his equipment and tournament fees. He'd never known about that ring, never known that I'd given up my last connection to my mother so he could chase his dreams. When he graduated high school and needed a reliable car for his part-time job, I'd taken out a second mortgage on the house. The payments had stretched my budget so thin that I'd started growing vegetables in the backyard not as a hobby, but as a necessity. Tomatoes, lettuce, green beans, anything that could supplement our grocery budget and keep us fed while ensuring Nathan had what he needed. During his senior year of college, when he'd called home crying because his laptop had crashed and he couldn't afford a new one, I'd quietly canceled my health insurance for 6 months and used the money to buy him the best computer I could find. I'd told myself I was young enough then, only 55, that I could risk going without coverage for a little while. The chest pains I'd been experiencing could wait. My son's education couldn't. And when Nathan met Tanya during his first year working at the accounting firm, when he'd wanted to impress her with expensive dates and weekend trips, I'd been the one he'd turned to for temporary loans that we both knew would never be repaid. I'd written check after check, watching my modest savings account dwindle while telling myself that love was worth the investment, that someday he'd be financially stable enough to take care of himself. The wedding had been the final blow to my financial security. Tanya's parents had contributed a substantial amount, but there were so many extras, so many little things, that Nathan assured me would make the day perfect. The upgraded photographer, the premium flowers, the open bar that seemed essential for their social circle. I'd emptied my retirement account, every dollar I'd managed to save during 25 years of working at the diner, to give them the wedding Tanya had dreamed of. It's an investment in their future, I'd told myself as I signed the withdrawal papers. A mother only gets one chance to give her son the perfect wedding. But the sacrifices hadn't ended with the wedding. There had been the down payment for their first house, a loan of $15,000 that I'd borrowed against my own mortgage. The nursery furniture when Emma was born, because Tanya had insisted that hand-me-downs weren't safe for modern babies. The private preschool tuition when they'd decided the public options weren't good enough for their children's education. Each request had come with the same gentle manipulation. "We'll pay you back as soon as things settle down," or "We just need help getting on our feet," or, my personal favorite, "You know we'd do the same for you." But somehow, things never seemed to settle down for them, and I never seemed to need the kind of help that required thousands of dollars and no questions asked. I set the photograph down and walked to the small desk in my living room where I kept my financial records. The files were meticulously organized, a habit I'd developed during my years of stretching every dollar until it screamed. I pulled out the folder labeled Nathan and spread its contents across the coffee table. Bank statements showing transfers to their accounts. Receipts for gifts I'd bought for the grandchildren, not just birthdays and Christmas, but random toys and clothes because Tanya had mentioned they were struggling with unexpected expenses. Credit card statements showing the vacation I'd paid for last summer when Nathan had explained that they desperately needed a break but couldn't afford to take one. The numbers painted a devastating picture. Over the past 15 years, I'd given them nearly $80,000. Money that could have secured my own retirement, that could have ensured I'd never be a burden to anyone. Instead, I was living on Social Security and the small pension from the diner, carefully budgeting every grocery trip while they enjoyed a lifestyle I'd helped make possible but could never afford for myself. And what had I received in return? Occasional phone calls that felt more like obligation than affection. Visits that always seemed to coincide with requests for financial help. Grandchildren who barely knew me because I wasn't invited to their birthday parties or school events. Apparently, their social circle didn't include elderly grandmothers who worked in diners and lived in modest houses. The cruelest irony was that my financial support had helped them achieve a social status that now made them embarrassed of me. Tanya's friends were all married to lawyers and doctors, women who lunched at country clubs and drove cars that cost more than I'd made in 5 years. My presence at their gatherings, with my discount store clothes and working-class mannerisms, had become an inconvenience they managed rather than a joy they celebrated. I remembered the last time I'd been invited to one of their parties. It had been Nathan's birthday 2 years ago, and I'd saved for weeks to buy him a nice gift. I'd arrived at their house, the one I'd helped them purchase, wearing my best dress and carrying a carefully wrapped present. But the moment I'd walked through the door, I'd felt Tanya's subtle disapproval in the way she'd introduced me to her friends. "This is Nathan's mother," she'd said. Not, "This is Margaret." Not, "This is Nathan's mom who helped raise the most wonderful man." Just Nathan's mother, as if I were a necessary but slightly embarrassing accessory to her husband's life. I'd spent the evening making polite conversation with people who clearly had no interest in talking to a retired diner waitress, watching my son charm his wife's wealthy friends while barely acknowledging my presence. When I'd left that night, Nathan had walked me to my car, not out of courtesy, but because Tanya had sent him to make sure I actually left. "Thanks for coming, Mom," he'd said, but his eyes had been on his phone, already distracted by text messages from the party continuing inside without me. That night, I'd driven home to my empty house and sat in my dark kitchen, finally understanding that I'd raised a son who loved me conditionally. As long as I could provide financial support and remained invisible when it mattered socially, I was valued. But the moment I stopped being useful or became an embarrassment, I would be discarded like an old appliance that had outlived its purpose. The realization should have been more shocking, but instead, it felt like the final piece of a puzzle I'd been trying to solve for years. All those times Nathan had visited but spent the entire time on his phone. All those holidays when they'd made other plans without including me. All those grandchildren's milestones I'd learned about through social media posts, rather than personal invitations. I wasn't Nathan's mother. I was Nathan's ATM. And now that my usefulness was coming to an end, now that my age was making me more of a liability than an asset, I was being managed, controlled, and slowly erased from a life I'd spent 40 years building for someone else. The coffee cup in my hands had gone completely cold, but I continued to hold it, needing something solid to anchor me as I faced the devastating truth. I had spent my entire adult life buying love that was never actually for sale, investing in a relationship that had been transactional from the very beginning. Was I used? The question echoed in my mind like a prayer I didn't want to answer. But deep down, in the part of my heart that I'd been trying to protect for years, I already knew the truth. Yes, I had been used, thoroughly, systematically, and completely. The microwave meals arrived 3 days later, delivered by Tanya with the efficiency of someone checking an unpleasant task off her to-do list. She stood in my doorway holding 3 enormous boxes labeled Healthy Choice Senior Meals. As if my 68 years of cooking experience had suddenly become irrelevant, replaced by the wisdom of food scientists and corporate nutritionists who'd never met me. This way, you don't have to worry about the stove, Tanya announced, setting the boxes on my counter with a satisfied smile. Just microwave for 3 minutes. Even has portion control built right in. I nodded and smiled. The same polite expression I'd perfected over years of swallowing words that might have caused conflict. But inside, something was crumbling. These weren't meals. They were evidence of my diminished status. Proof that I'd been reclassified from family matriarch to elderly dependent who couldn't be trusted with basic life skills. The boxes sat unopened on my counter for 4 days. Every time I walked past them, I felt a fresh wave of humiliation. When had I become someone who needed to be managed? When had my family decided that convenience mattered more than the love I'd poured into every meal I'd ever prepared? The silence in my house had become its own presence. My phone, which used to ring with calls from Nathan checking in or requests from Tanya about babysitting, now sat quiet for days at a time. The grandchildren, who used to beg to come stay overnight so I could make them pancakes in the morning, hadn't visited in over a month. Their absence felt deliberate, as if I'd been quarantined from their lives until I could prove I was safe to be around. I started marking the days on my kitchen calendar. Not because I had anywhere to be, but because the sameness of each day was making time feel meaningless. Tuesday became Thursday, became Saturday without any variation in routine. Wake up, heat a frozen meal I couldn't taste, sit in my living room watching television programs that reminded me how much the world had changed while I wasn't paying attention. The worst part wasn't the boredom. It was the growing realization that my family wasn't missing me. Nathan's life continued perfectly without my presence, without my cooking, without my voice asking about his day or his children's latest accomplishments. I'd thought myself indispensable, but apparently, I'd been merely convenient. Then came my birthday, September 14th, a date I'd been celebrating for 68 years. A day that had always involved at least a phone call, usually a card, sometimes a small gathering with cake I'd baked myself because nobody else knew my favorite flavor was lemon with cream cheese frosting. This year, nothing. I woke up that morning with the strange hope that maybe Nathan had planned a surprise, that perhaps the silence of recent weeks had been preparation for something special. I showered and put on my nicest dress, the burgundy one with tiny flowers that my husband had bought me for our last anniversary before he died. I even applied lipstick, something I rarely bothered with anymore. By noon, I was sitting by my phone, willing it to ring. By 3 o'clock, I was checking my mailbox for cards that hadn't arrived. By evening, I was staring at my silent phone and wondering if I'd somehow forgotten to tell them it was my birthday, if the fault was mine for assuming they'd remember. At 8:30 that night, Tanya posted a photo on social media. The whole family at a restaurant I recognized, the expensive steakhouse downtown where they celebrated special occasions. Nathan was raising a glass of wine, Emma and Michael were grinning at the camera, and the caption read, "Celebrating life's beautiful moments with the people who matter most. Family, first, blessed." I stared at that photo for 20 minutes, zooming in on their faces, looking for any sign that someone had remembered it was my birthday and felt guilty about excluding me. But all I saw were 4 people genuinely enjoying themselves, completely unaware that they'd forgotten the woman who'd made their happiness possible. That night, I did something I hadn't done since my husband's funeral. I cried until my chest ached, until my eyes were so swollen I could barely see. Not the quiet, dignified tears I'd shed over smaller disappointments, but the raw, ugly sobbing of someone who'd just realized they'd been living a lie. The next morning, Nathan called. Not to apologize or explain, but to ask if I could babysit the following weekend. They had tickets to a charity gala, another social event in their carefully curated life where my presence would be an inconvenience. "Sure," I heard myself say, the word escaping before I could stop it, because that's what I always did. I said yes to the requests and no to my own feelings. "Great. Thanks, Mom. You're a lifesaver." The phrase that once made me feel valuable now felt like mockery. A lifesaver. Someone useful in emergencies but not worth including in celebrations. The babysitting weekend revealed another layer of my diminished status. When I arrived at their house Saturday afternoon, Tanya handed me a typed list of instructions that read like a manual for managing an incompetent employee. Emergency numbers were highlighted in yellow. Mealtimes were specified to the minute. There were even instructions for operating their television remote, as if I'd never encountered modern technology. Emma's soccer game is at 10 tomorrow, Tanya mentioned while gathering her purse and keys. But you don't need to go. It's probably too much for you to handle. Too much for me to handle? I'd been attending my grandchildren's events since they were born, had never missed a birthday party or school play when I was invited. But apparently, sitting in bleachers and cheering for my granddaughter was now beyond my capabilities. That evening, while the children were watching a movie, I overheard Emma talking to her friend on the phone. "No, Grandma can't pick us up," she was saying. "Daddy says she's not supposed to drive places anymore because she might get confused." Not supposed to drive places anymore? I'd been driving for 50 years without a single serious accident. My car was older but well-maintained, and I'd never shown any signs of confusion behind the wheel. But somehow, the narrative of my incompetence had spread to include my granddaughter, who now saw me as someone who couldn't be trusted with basic adult responsibilities. When Nathan and Tanya returned from their gala, they barely acknowledged my presence. No questions about how the evening had gone. No interest in the stories I could have shared about my time with their children. I was thanked with the same casual dismissal they might give a hired babysitter, then sent home with leftover containers of food I hadn't asked for. Another reminder that I was now someone who needed to be taken care of, rather than someone capable of taking care of others. The drive home in my supposedly unreliable car gave me time to think about the systematic way I was being erased from my own family. It wasn't happening through dramatic confrontations or explicit rejections. Instead, I was being slowly edited out of their lives through a series of small exclusions and casual dismissals, each one justified as being for my own good or easier for everyone. Back in my empty house, I sat in my kitchen, the room I was no longer allowed to use for its intended purpose, and tried to remember the last time someone in my family had asked my opinion about anything important. When had they stopped seeking my advice about parenting decisions or career choices? When had my decades of life experience become irrelevant to people who'd once valued my wisdom? The answer was gradually becoming clear. I'd stopped mattering the moment I'd stopped being useful in the ways they preferred. As long as I could provide money, free babysitting, and convenient solutions to their problems, I had value. But the moment my age became more apparent, the moment I needed any consideration or accommodation, I became a burden to be managed rather than a person to be cherished. I looked around my kitchen at the appliances I was forbidden to use, the recipes I was no longer allowed to prepare, the traditions I'd been prevented from continuing. Everything that had defined me as a wife, mother, and grandmother had been systematically stripped away under the guise of protecting me. But protection from what? From the possibility of making mistakes? From the risk of being human and fallible? Or from the inconvenience my independence might cause to people who preferred me compliant and manageable? The question that had been growing in my mind finally demanded an answer. Was this love? Or was this control? And if I couldn't tell the difference anymore, what did that say about the relationship I'd spent my entire adult life nurturing? For the first time in my 68 years, I began to wonder if the people I'd sacrificed everything for actually wanted me in their lives, or if they just wanted what I could provide. And more terrifyingly, I began to suspect I already knew the answer. The discovery came by accident, the way most devastating truths do. I was looking for a pen in Nathan's kitchen drawer during my weekly babysitting duty when my fingers found a stack of papers tucked beneath the takeout menus and expired coupons. Financial documents with my name on them. Documents I'd never seen before. My hands trembled as I pulled out the papers, recognizing the letterhead of First National Bank. There, in black and white, was a joint account I didn't remember opening. An account with my name listed as secondary holder, containing a balance that made my breath catch in my throat. $47,000. $47,000. More money than I'd seen in one place since I'd emptied my retirement account for Nathan's wedding. Money that had apparently been sitting there while I'd been carefully budgeting my grocery trips and wearing shoes with holes in the soles because I couldn't afford new ones. I kept reading, my confusion growing with each line. Automatic deposits from my Social Security checks, transfers from the small savings account I thought contained my emergency fund, even the insurance payout from my husband's life insurance policy, money I'd believed had been lost to some bureaucratic mix-up years ago. The deposits showed a pattern going back 18 months. Every penny I received had been redirected to this account, leaving me with just enough cash to cover basic utilities and the cheapest possible groceries. I'd been living like a pauper while Nathan managed thousands of dollars that legally belonged to me, but it was the withdrawal history that made my legs give out, forcing me to sit heavily in one of Nathan's expensive kitchen chairs, luxury resort bookings, high-end restaurant charges, a payment to Tanya's favorite spa, even a down payment on what appeared to be a vacation home in the mountains, all paid for with money that had been quietly siphoned from my accounts. "Grandma, are you okay?" Emma's voice seemed to come from very far away. I looked up to find my 7-year-old granddaughter staring at me with concern, her small face scrunched with worry. "I'm fine, sweetheart," I managed, though my voice sounded hollow even to my own ears. I folded the papers with shaking hands and slipped them into my purse, just resting for a minute. But I wasn't fine. I was drowning in the realization that my financial hardship hadn't been an unfortunate consequence of aging, it had been deliberately orchestrated. While I'd been eating peanut butter sandwiches for dinner and turning down my thermostat to save money, my son had been using my funds to finance a lifestyle I could never afford. The rest of that evening passed in a blur. I helped the children with homework I could barely focus on, made them dinner from ingredients I now knew had been purchased with my own money, and smiled through bedtime stories while my heart hammered against my ribs like a caged bird. When Nathan and Tanya returned from their dinner out, another meal that had probably cost more than I spent on food in a month, I watched them with new eyes. Tanya's designer handbag, Nathan's expensive watch, the casual way they discussed their upcoming weekend trip to wine country, all of it funded by the woman they'd decided was too incompetent to manage her own kitchen. "Thanks for watching them, Mom," Nathan said, handing me a $20 bill like I was hired help. "We really appreciate it." $20 for 7 hours of childcare from a woman they'd stolen $47,000 from. The insult was so breathtaking, I almost laughed. Instead, I took the money and drove home in silence, my mind reeling with the magnitude of what I'd discovered. This wasn't just financial irresponsibility or poor communication. This was theft, pure and simple. My own son had systematically stolen my security, my independence, my future, while convincing me that I was the one who needed to be protected. At home, I spread my own financial records across my kitchen table and began the painful process of reconciling what I'd thought I knew with what I'd just learned. Bank statements that had seemed confusing now made perfect sense. The missing insurance money, the Social Security deposits that never seemed to last as long as they should, the credit card bills for purchases I'd never made. It all painted a picture of systematic financial abuse. I called the bank the next morning, my voice steady despite the fury burning in my chest. "I need to know about account number 4467892, I told the customer service representative. "I'm sorry, ma'am, but you're listed as a secondary holder on that account. I can only discuss account details with the primary holder unless he's given us written authorization. The primary holder is my son. The money in that account came from my Social Security and insurance policies. How is that legal?" There was a pause. "Ma'am, when a joint account is established with someone as primary holder, they have full authority to manage all funds, regardless of the source. If you have concerns about unauthorized access to your money, you might want to speak with an attorney." An attorney. The suggestion hung in the air like a death sentence for whatever remained of my relationship with my son. But as I hung up the phone, I realized that relationship had already been dead for years. I'd just been too desperate for love to notice I was mourning a corpse. That afternoon, Emma called me. Not Nathan, not Tanya, my 7-year-old granddaughter, her small voice tentative through the phone. "Grandma? Daddy says you can't babysit anymore because you're sick. Are you dying?" The question hit me like a physical blow. "No, sweetheart. I'm not dying. I'm not sick either." "Why would Daddy say that? He told Mommy that you were getting confused and it wasn't safe for us to be alone with you. But you seemed fine yesterday. You helped me with my math homework, and you remembered that I don't like crusts on my sandwiches. Confused, unsafe. They were building a narrative about my mental state to justify cutting me out of their lives entirely. Soon I realized they'd probably suggest I needed professional care. Maybe even that I should sign over power of attorney to Nathan so he could help me manage my affairs. Emma, honey, I want you to know that I love you very much, I said, tears burning my eyes. Sometimes grown-ups have disagreements, but that doesn't change how much I love you and Michael. I love you too, Grandma. I wish Daddy would let you cook for us again. The microwave food tastes like cardboard. After Emma hung up, I sat in my kitchen and finally allowed myself to feel the full weight of my betrayal. My son hadn't just stolen my money. He'd stolen my relationship with my grandchildren, poisoning their understanding of who I was and why I was suddenly absent from their lives. But beneath the devastation, something else was stirring. Anger. Clean, pure, righteous anger that felt more energizing than anything I'd experienced in years. I'd spent my entire adult life being accommodating, understanding, flexible. I'd swallowed insults and ignored red flags and made excuses for behavior that should have been unacceptable. No more. I picked up my phone and called my neighbor, Dorothy Chen, a retired attorney who'd been trying to befriend me for months with invitations for coffee that I'd politely declined, thinking I was too busy helping my family to cultivate new relationships. Dorothy? This is Margaret from next door. I know this is short notice, but I need legal advice. And I need it today. 3 hours later, Dorothy sat in my living room with a cup of tea I'd managed to make despite my supposed incompetence, listening to my story with the focused attention of someone who'd spent her career dealing with family financial abuse. This is more common than you'd think, she said when I finished. Adult children who convince themselves they're protecting elderly parents while systematically stealing their independence and resources. The legal term is financial elder abuse, and it's a felony. I don't want to put my son in jail, I said quickly. I just want my money back and my life back. Dorothy nodded. That's understandable. But Margaret, you need to understand something. This pattern of behavior doesn't usually stop on its own. If Nathan faces no consequences for what he's done, he'll likely escalate. Eventually, he might try to have you declared incompetent so he can gain full control of your assets. The thought sent ice through my veins. Was that the endgame? Had the restrictions on my cooking and driving been the first steps in a longer plan to have me declared unfit to manage my own life? What do I do? I asked. Dorothy smiled, and for the first time in months, I saw something in another person's eyes that I'd almost forgotten existed. Respect. We fight back, she said simply. We close the joint account, we retrieve your money, and we make it very clear that you're not the confused elderly woman they've convinced themselves you are. You're a competent adult who's been the victim of financial abuse, and you're not going to tolerate it anymore. That night, I slept better than I had in months, because for the first time since this nightmare began, I wasn't alone. Someone believed me, someone respected me, and someone was willing to help me reclaim what had been stolen. Tomorrow, the real fight would begin. The bank manager looked at me with barely concealed condescension as I sat across from his polished desk, my hands folded in my lap like a schoolchild called to the principal's office. Behind him, framed certificates and awards decorated the wall, testimonials to his expertise in managing other people's money, something he clearly believed I was incapable of doing myself. Mrs. Morrison, I understand your concerns, he said in the tone people use when they're about to dismiss everything you've just said, but the joint account was established legally, with proper documentation. Your son has power of attorney privileges that allow him to manage your finances for your protection. I never signed any power of attorney, I said firmly, my voice steadier than I'd expected. I never gave Nathan permission to redirect my Social Security payments or access my insurance money. The manager, his nameplate read Richard Steinberg, shuffled through the papers in front of him with theatrical efficiency. According to our records, all necessary signatures were obtained when the account was established. Your son presented documentation showing concerns about your cognitive decline and your need for financial assistance. Cognitive decline. The phrase hit me like a slap. I leaned forward in my chair, fixing this stranger with a stare that had once made my teenage son clean his room without argument. Mr. Steinberg, do I seem cognitively impaired to you? I drove myself here. I'm conducting this conversation coherently, and I'm asking reasonable questions about my own money. What exactly suggests I'm incapable of managing my finances? For the first time, uncertainty flickered across his face. Well, no, you seem... But the documentation we have on file. May I see this documentation? He hesitated, clearly uncomfortable with the shift in our conversation's power dynamic. I'm afraid I can't share those documents without your son's permission, since he's the primary account holder. But it's my money, I said, my voice rising slightly. Money that came from my Social Security, my late husband's insurance policy, my own accounts. How can my son have more rights to my money than I do? The question hung in the air between us, and I watched Mr. Steinberg struggle with the legal complexity of a situation that probably seemed straightforward when Nathan had first walked into his office 18 months ago. A concerned son protecting his aging mother's finances. Such a noble narrative that no one had bothered to question whether the mother wanted or needed such protection. Mrs. Morrison, he finally said, if you believe there's been some error or misunderstanding, I recommend you consult with an attorney. The bank is required to follow the legal documentation we have on file. I stood up, gathering my purse with the deliberate dignity of someone who'd spent too many years being underestimated. Mr. Steinberg, you'll be hearing from my attorney very soon, and when she contacts you, I suggest you review your documentation very carefully. Because if my son forged my signature or misrepresented my mental state to gain access to my money, this bank could be held liable for facilitating financial elder abuse. The color drained from his face. Mrs. Morrison, I assure you that First National Bank would never knowingly... Good day, Mr. Steinberg. I walked out of that bank with my spine straighter than it had been in months. Yes, I was still trapped by legal documents I'd apparently never signed and procedures designed to protect banks rather than elderly customers. But something fundamental had shifted inside me. I was no longer asking for permission to access my own life. I was demanding it. Dorothy was waiting for me at the coffee shop across the street, her silver hair catching the afternoon sunlight streaming through the windows. She looked up from her legal pad as I approached, and I could see the anticipation in her eyes. How did it go? She asked, though my expression probably told her everything she needed to know. About as expected, I said, sliding into the booth across from her. The bank manager treated me like a confused old woman who doesn't understand how money works. Apparently, Nathan has documentation that I'm mentally incompetent. Dorothy nodded grimly. That's standard procedure for this type of financial abuse. The perpetrator creates a paper trail that justifies their actions, making it harder for the victim to challenge them later. She flipped to a fresh page on her legal pad. But we're going to challenge everything. I've already contacted a colleague who specializes in elder law, and she's reviewing your case. What happens now? Now we start taking back control, Dorothy said, her voice carrying the confidence of someone who'd fought similar battles and won. First, we're going to get you a new bank account, one that only you have access to. Then we're going to redirect your Social Security payments and any other income streams back to accounts Nathan can't touch. The simple act of opening a new bank account felt revolutionary. For the first time in 18 months, I held an ATM card that belonged only to me. Watched as my signature was recorded for an account that no one else could access or control. The bank officer, a young woman named Jennifer who treated me with basic human respect, explained the features of my new checking account as if I were a competent adult capable of understanding financial concepts. Would you like to set up automatic bill pay for your utilities? Jennifer asked. It can help ensure your payments are never late. I almost laughed. 6 months ago, Nathan had convinced me I was too forgetful to manage automatic payments, insisting he needed to oversee all my financial obligations. Yet, here was this stranger, casually offering me the same financial tools she'd offer any other customer, without questioning my mental capacity or requiring supervision from a relative. Yes, I said. I'd like that very much. That evening, I made dinner for the first time in weeks. Not a microwaved frozen meal, but real food cooked on my supposedly dangerous stove. Chicken breast seasoned with herbs from my garden, rice pilaf, and green beans that I picked from the plants I'd grown myself. The act of cooking felt like a small rebellion, a reclamation of skills that had never actually disappeared despite what everyone kept telling me. I was setting the table for one when my doorbell rang. Through the peephole, I saw Nathan standing on my front porch, his usually confident posture replaced by obvious agitation. His expensive suit was wrinkled, his tie loosened, and he kept checking his phone with the frantic energy of someone dealing with an unexpected crisis. I opened the door but didn't invite him in. "Mom, we need to talk," he said, his voice tight with barely controlled panic. "The bank called me. They said you were asking questions about our joint account." "My account," I corrected him. "My money that you've been stealing for the past 18 months. His face went pale. "Stealing? Mom, I've been managing your finances to protect you. You were getting confused about payments, remember? I was helping you. By redirecting my Social Security to an account I didn't know existed? By using my insurance money to pay for your vacations? That's not help, Nathan. That's theft. You signed the papers," he said desperately. "You agreed to let me help manage your money. Show me my signature," I said. "Show me the documents where I supposedly agreed to give you control of my finances." He fumbled for his phone, scrolling through what I assumed were copies of the bank documents. But as he searched, something in his expression told me he was realizing the same thing I already knew. He couldn't produce my genuine signature because I'd never actually signed anything. "Mom, you're not thinking clearly," he said, switching tactics. "This confusion, these accusations, they're symptoms of what we discussed with your doctor. You need help, and I'm trying to provide it." "What doctor?" I asked. "I haven't seen a doctor in over a year, except for my routine physical, and Dr. Martinez said I was in excellent health for my age." Nathan's face flushed red. "Tanya spoke with someone, a specialist, about age-related cognitive decline." "Tanya spoke with someone about me, without my knowledge or consent? Nathan, do you understand how insane that sounds?" For a moment, I saw something flicker across his face, a flash of uncertainty, maybe even shame, but it disappeared quickly, replaced by the stubborn defensiveness of someone who'd convinced himself his lies were justified. "I'm trying to protect you," he said, "from making mistakes that could hurt you financially." "The only person who's hurt me financially is you," I said. "You've stolen nearly $50,000 from me while convincing everyone I'm too incompetent to notice. That ends now. Mom, if you keep making these accusations, people are going to think that I'm standing up for myself, that I refuse to be stolen from and lied about. Good. Let them think that." I started to close the door, but Nathan put his hand against it, his composure finally cracking completely. "You can't cut me out," he said, his voice rising. "I'm your son. Everything I've done has been for your own good." "No," I said, looking him directly in the eyes. "Everything you've done has been for your own good. You've used me, Nathan. You've stolen from me, lied about me, and isolated me from my own grandchildren. But that stops today. You need me," he said desperately. "You can't manage on your own anymore." I smiled then, the first genuine smile I'd felt in months. "Watch me." This time when I closed the door, he didn't try to stop me. I turned the deadbolt with a satisfying click and leaned against the door, listening to his footsteps retreat down my front walkway. Back in my kitchen, my dinner was still warm. I sat at my table, the same table where I'd discovered the truth about my finances, where I'd made the decision to fight back, and ate a meal I'd cooked myself in a kitchen I was supposedly too dangerous to use. For the first time in 18 months, I tasted my food. Really tasted it. The herbs were fragrant, the chicken perfectly seasoned, the rice fluffy and satisfying. It was a simple meal, nothing fancy or complicated, but it was mine, prepared by my hands, seasoned according to my preferences, eaten at my own pace without anyone monitoring my capability or questioning my choices. Outside, the sun was setting over the neighborhood I'd called home for 38 years. Tomorrow would bring new challenges, legal battles, difficult conversations, probably more attempts from Nathan to convince others that I was mentally incompetent. But tonight, I was a woman who'd cooked her own dinner, managed her own finances, and stood up to the person who'd been stealing her dignity one piece at a time. Tonight, I was free. The letter arrived on a Thursday morning, delivered by certified mail with the kind of official weight that makes your hands shake before you even break the seal. Inside, legal letterhead announced the unthinkable. Nathan was petitioning the court to have me declared mentally incompetent, requesting full guardianship over my person and my finances. The words blurred together as I read them. Significant cognitive decline, unable to manage daily affairs, danger to herself and others. Each phrase was a knife twisted deeper into the heart of who I'd believed myself to be. According to this document, I was no longer Margaret Morrison, retired diner waitress and devoted mother. I was a problem to be solved, a burden to be managed, a broken thing that needed fixing. But it was the supporting evidence that made my blood run cold. Statements from Tanya describing my erratic behavior and memory problems. A letter from Dr. Harrison, a psychiatrist I'd never met, recommending immediate intervention based on family reports of dangerous incidents. Even a statement from the bank manager, Mr. Steinberg, confirming Nathan's long-standing concerns about my financial judgment. They'd built an entire case against my sanity without my knowledge, creating a paper trail of fabricated evidence designed to strip away the last vestiges of my independence. The competency hearing was scheduled for the following Monday, 5 days to prepare for a legal battle that would determine whether I spent the rest of my life as a ward of the state, or worse, under Nathan's complete control. I called Dorothy immediately, my voice shaking as I read the petition aloud. Her sharp intake of breath told me everything I needed to know about the seriousness of my situation. "This is aggressive, even for a financial abuse case," she said when I finished. "Nathan's escalating because he knows we're closing in on him. A competency ruling would give him legal cover for everything he's done and everything he plans to do. Can they actually do this? Can they take away my right to make my own decisions based on lies?" "They can try," Dorothy said grimly. "But Margaret, this is war now. We're not just fighting for your money anymore. We're fighting for your fundamental human rights. Are you ready for that battle?" I looked around my kitchen, at the stove I'd been forbidden to use, at the refrigerator that had been stocked with meals I supposedly couldn't prepare myself, at the calendar where I'd been marking empty days in a life that had been systematically dismantled. Then I thought about Emma's voice on the phone, asking if I was dying, about Michael, who would grow up believing his grandmother was crazy, about all the meals I'd never cook again, all the memories I'd never make, all the love I'd never be allowed to give. "Yes," I said, "I'm ready." The weekend became a whirlwind of preparation. Dorothy's colleague, attorney Sarah Walsh, arrived Saturday morning with boxes of legal documents and a team of investigators who specialized in elder abuse cases. They spread out across my dining room table like generals planning a military campaign, which, in a way, they were. "We need to document everything," Sarah explained, her voice carrying the authority of someone who'd fought similar battles and won. "Every lie they've told, every document they've forged, every dollar they've stolen. By Monday, we're going to have a counterpetition so comprehensive that Nathan will regret ever starting this fight." They photographed the microwave meals still sitting unopened in my pantry. They documented the kitchen appliances I'd been forbidden to use, still in perfect working order. They interviewed my neighbors, who testified that I'd never shown any signs of confusion or dangerous behavior. Mrs. Patterson from 2 houses down even provided security camera footage showing me maintaining my garden with perfect competence. Hardly the behavior of someone suffering from severe cognitive decline. But the most damaging evidence came from the bank records Sarah subpoenaed. Not only had Nathan forged my signature on multiple documents, but the timeline revealed a pattern of systematic theft that coincided perfectly with his family's lifestyle upgrades: the down payment for their second car, the renovation of their master bathroom, the private school tuition for Emma and Michael. Every major expense in their lives for the past 2 years had been funded with money stolen from my accounts. Sunday evening, as we prepared for the hearing, Sarah laid out our strategy with clinical precision. "Nathan has made a crucial mistake," she explained. "He's painted you as someone suffering from severe dementia, but the evidence shows you functioning independently until the exact moment he decided you were inconvenient. Either you've experienced the most convenient recovery in medical history, or he's been lying about your condition from the beginning. What happens if we lose?" I asked. Sarah's expression softened slightly. We won't lose, Margaret. Nathan has overplayed his hand. But even if something went wrong, even if the worst happened, you've already won something more important than this court case. What's that? You've remembered who you are. Monday morning arrived gray and drizzling, the kind of weather that seemed designed to match my mood as Dorothy and I walked up the courthouse steps. Inside, the family court felt like a theater designed for tragedy. Fluorescent lights that drained the color from everything, wooden benches that had witnessed countless family destructions, and an atmosphere heavy with the weight of broken relationships. Nathan sat at the plaintiff's table with his attorney, a sharp-dressed man who looked like he specialized in making elderly people disappear into nursing homes. Tanya sat behind them, her designer outfit and perfectly styled hair suggesting this was just another social engagement, rather than an attempt to destroy her mother-in-law's life. But it was the sight of Emma and Michael in the hallway that nearly broke my resolve. My grandchildren, dressed in their best clothes, looking confused and frightened as they waited to testify about their grandmother's supposed mental decline. Nathan had weaponized my own grandchildren against me, turning them into unwilling participants in his campaign to steal my freedom. When the hearing began, Nathan's attorney painted a picture of a dangerous, confused old woman who posed a threat to herself and others. He presented the forged psychiatric evaluation, the fabricated bank statements, the carefully orchestrated testimony from people who'd never actually witnessed the incidents they described. Mrs. Morrison represents a clear and present danger, he concluded. She has threatened family members, made irrational financial decisions, and demonstrated an inability to care for herself safely. The family has exhausted all other options and reluctantly seeks the court's protection for a woman they love, but can no longer trust to make rational decisions. It was a masterful performance, built on 18 months of careful preparation and supported by documents that looked official enough to fool anyone who didn't look too closely. If I hadn't known the truth, I might have believed it myself. Then Sarah stood up. Your Honor, she began, her voice cutting through the courtroom's oppressive atmosphere like a blade through silk. The petitioner has presented this court with a work of fiction so elaborate it would be impressive if it weren't so morally reprehensible. She systematically dismantled every piece of Nathan's case. The psychiatric evaluation was revealed to be a consultation report based entirely on hearsay from family members, not an actual examination of me. The bank statements showed a pattern of financial abuse, not incompetence on my part. The witnesses who'd testified about my dangerous behavior were caught in contradictions when pressed for specific dates and details. But the most devastating moment came when Sarah played the security camera footage from my neighbor's house. There I was, 2 weeks earlier, competently operating a ladder to clean my gutters. Hardly the behavior of someone too confused to use a kitchen stove safely. Mrs. Morrison, Sarah said, turning to address me directly, has been the victim of a systematic campaign of financial and emotional abuse designed to isolate her from her support systems and justify stealing her resources. The petitioner hasn't presented evidence of incompetence. He's presented evidence of his own criminal behavior. When it was my turn to testify, I walked to the witness stand with my head held high. Nathan's attorney tried to rattle me with questions about my age, my living situation, my daily routines. But for every question designed to make me seem confused or vulnerable, I had a clear, detailed answer that demonstrated exactly the opposite. Mrs. Morrison, he asked, clearly frustrated by my coherent responses, don't you think it would be easier to let your family take care of these burdensome responsibilities? I looked directly at Nathan as I answered. I've spent my entire adult life taking care of my family's responsibilities. I've sacrificed my security, my comfort, and my peace of mind to ensure their happiness. But I will not sacrifice my dignity and my freedom to make their theft more convenient. The courtroom fell silent. Nathan stared at his hands, unable to meet my eyes. Your Honor, I continued, I am 68 years old, not dead. I am a woman who has earned the right to make my own decisions, even if those decisions inconvenience people who'd prefer me to be manageable and silent. I am asking this court to protect my fundamental human rights against people who would steal them under the guise of love. Judge Patricia Hendricks, a woman in her 60s who'd probably witnessed every variation of family greed imaginable, took less than 10 minutes to reach her decision. "The petition for guardianship is denied," she announced, her voice carrying the weight of absolute authority. "Furthermore, this court finds evidence of financial elder abuse and is referring this matter to the District Attorney's Office for criminal investigation." Nathan's face went white. Tanya actually gasped. Their attorney began shuffling papers with the frantic energy of someone trying to minimize a legal disaster. But Judge Hendricks wasn't finished. "Mr. Morrison," she said, her voice cold enough to freeze water, "you have systematically abused a woman who spent her life caring for you. You have stolen her money, isolated her from her grandchildren, and attempted to convince this court that she was mentally incompetent when the evidence clearly shows you are morally bankrupt. I am issuing a restraining order prohibiting you from contacting Mrs. Morrison or coming within 500 feet of her residence. Any violation will result in immediate arrest." As the gavel fell, I felt something I hadn't experienced in years: complete and total vindication, not just legal victory, but the restoration of my fundamental human worth in the eyes of people who mattered. Nathan tried to approach me as we left the courtroom, but Dorothy stepped between us like a protective shield. "Don't," she said simply. "You've done enough damage." I walked out of that courthouse a different woman than the one who'd entered. Behind me lay the wreckage of a relationship I'd spent 40 years building, but ahead of me, for the first time in decades, lay a future that belonged entirely to me. The morning after the court hearing, I woke up to something I hadn't experienced in over 2 years. Complete silence. Not the hollow, oppressive quiet of isolation, but the peaceful stillness of a woman who finally owned her own life. No one could walk into my house uninvited. No one could access my bank accounts. No one could make decisions about my competence or my future without my consent. I was free. I made coffee in my own kitchen. Real coffee. Not the instant powder Nathan had convinced me was easier to manage. And sat at my table watching the sunrise paint my backyard in shades of gold and pink. The roses I'd planted years ago were blooming magnificently, as if they'd been waiting for this moment to show their full glory. Everything looked the same as it had yesterday, but somehow the entire world felt different. At 10 o'clock, Dorothy knocked on my door carrying a bottle of champagne and a smile that could have powered the entire neighborhood. "How does it feel to be officially competent?" she asked, settling into my living room with the comfortable familiarity of someone who'd earned the right to be there. "Expensive," I laughed, thinking about the legal fees that had drained a significant portion of my recovered funds. "But worth every penny." We spent the morning going through the paperwork that would restore my complete financial independence. The joint account had been frozen pending the criminal investigation, but Sarah had managed to recover most of my stolen money through emergency court orders. For the first time in 18 months, my bank balance reflected my actual financial situation rather than Nathan's manipulated version of my needs. "What will you do now?" Dorothy asked as we finished reviewing the documents. The question hung in the air between us, heavy with possibility. For so many years, my future had been defined by other people's expectations and needs. I'd been Nathan's mother, then his financial resource, then his burden. I'd been my grandchildren's babysitter, then their embarrassment, then their dangerous relative who needed to be managed. But who was I when stripped of all those imposed identities? "I don't know," I admitted. "I've spent so long being who other people needed me to be that I'm not sure who I actually am anymore." Dorothy nodded with the understanding of someone who'd watched many women discover themselves later in life. "That's the beautiful part," she said. "Now you get to find out." That afternoon, I did something I hadn't done in decades. I went shopping for myself. Not grocery shopping with a carefully calculated budget and coupons clipped from newspapers, but actual shopping for things I wanted rather than things I needed. I drove to the mall, in my supposedly unreliable car that ran perfectly fine, and wandered through stores I'd never allowed myself to enter. In a boutique that specialized in clothing for mature women, I found a dress that made me feel like myself again. It was deep emerald green, a color that brought out my eyes and complemented my silver hair. The fabric was soft and flowing, comfortable but elegant, The kind of dress a confident woman would wear to dinner with friends or an evening at the theater. That color is stunning on you, the saleswoman said as I studied myself in the mirror. You should definitely take it. Should. The word that had governed my life for so many years, usually attached to obligations and sacrifices and other people's preferences. But this time, it was about something I wanted for myself. I'll take it, I said, the words feeling revolutionary. I also bought new sheets for my bed, soft Egyptian cotton in a pattern I loved, and a set of cooking utensils to replace the ones Nathan had deemed too dangerous for me to use. In the bookstore, I selected 3 novels I'd been wanting to read, but had never found time for when my days were consumed with other people's needs. At the grocery store, I filled my cart with ingredients for meals I actually wanted to eat. Fresh salmon, asparagus, good olive oil, artisanal bread from the bakery counter, wine, a bottle of Chardonnay that cost more than I used to spend on groceries for an entire week. These weren't purchases made out of necessity or careful budgeting, but choices made by a woman who'd decided her own pleasure mattered. That evening, I cooked myself a proper dinner. Not the simple, economical meals I'd been preparing for years, but the kind of food I used to make for special occasions. I set my table with the good china I'd been saving for company that never came, lit candles, and poured myself a glass of wine. As I ate, I thought about all the dinners I'd prepared for other people over the years. Holiday meals that had taken days to plan and prepare, birthday cakes decorated with trembling hands and bottomless love, comfort food served during illness and heartbreak. All of it had been about nourishing others, about expressing love through the medium of food. Tonight, for the first time in my adult life, I was nourishing myself. The phone rang as I was finishing dessert, a piece of chocolate cake I'd bought simply because it looked delicious. For a moment, my heart jumped, wondering if it might be Nathan attempting to violate the restraining order. But the caller ID showed a number I didn't recognize. Hello, Mrs. Morrison? This is Jennifer Walsh from Channel 7 News. We heard about your court case, and we'd like to interview you about elder financial abuse. Would you be interested in sharing your story? A news interview. 6 months ago, the thought would have terrified me. I was just a retired diner waitress. Nobody important. Nobody whose story mattered to strangers. But something had changed in that courtroom. Something fundamental about how I saw myself and my place in the world. Yes, I heard myself saying. I'd like that very much. The interview aired the following Friday, and the response was overwhelming. My phone rang constantly with calls from other elderly women sharing their own stories of financial abuse, from attorneys offering pro bono services, from advocacy groups working to change laws that made elder abuse easier to perpetrate and harder to prosecute. But the call that mattered most came from an unexpected source. Grandma? Emma's small voice was tentative, careful. I saw you on TV. My heart clenched. Hello, sweetheart. You looked really pretty. And you sounded different, stronger. I am stronger, I said. And Emma, I want you to know that none of this is your fault. Sometimes grown-ups make mistakes, but that doesn't change how much I love you. Daddy says we can't see you anymore, she said, her voice breaking my heart. But I miss you, Grandma. I miss your cookies and your stories and the way you always remembered what I like. I miss you too, baby. More than you can imagine. Will you still be my grandma? Even if Daddy says we can't visit? The question nearly undid me. Emma, I will always be your grandma. Always. That's not something that can be taken away, no matter what anyone says or does. After she hung up, I sat in my kitchen and cried. Not the bitter tears of loss and betrayal I'd shed so many times before, but the complex mixture of grief and hope that comes with accepting painful truths while still believing in the possibility of healing. 2 weeks later, Dorothy arrived at my door with a proposal that would change everything. There's a community center downtown that works with elderly women who've experienced abuse, she said. They're looking for someone to start a cooking program, teaching basic skills to women who've been isolated or controlled, helping them reclaim their independence through food preparation. The irony was perfect. I'd been forbidden to cook because it was supposedly dangerous, and now I was being asked to teach cooking as a form of empowerment. The pay isn't much, Dorothy continued, but it would give you a chance to use your skills to help other women who've been through what you experienced. I thought about all the meals I'd prepared over the years, all the love I'd poured into feeding others. What if that skill, the one Nathan had tried to take away from me, could become a tool for healing rather than just nourishment? "When do I start?" I asked. The first cooking class was small, just 5 women, all over 60, all carrying the invisible wounds of emotional and financial abuse. They stood in the community center's kitchen with the uncertain posture of people who'd been told they were incompetent for so long they'd begun to believe it themselves. "Ladies," I said, tying my apron around my waist, the same blue one with the faded embroidery that had once seemed like a symbol of my diminished worth. "Today we're going to make bread." "Bread?" asked Martha, a 70-year-old woman whose son had convinced her she was too forgetful to operate kitchen appliances. "Isn't that complicated?" "No more complicated than surviving what we've all survived," I said, "and a lot more rewarding." We spent the afternoon kneading dough and sharing stories. These women had all been told they were burdens, incompetent, dangerous to themselves and others. They'd all had their independence slowly stripped away under the guise of protection and care. But as we worked together, measuring ingredients and following recipes, something magical happened. We remembered who we were. By the end of the class, the kitchen was filled with the aroma of fresh bread and the sound of genuine laughter. These women who'd been isolated and silenced were talking, sharing, supporting each other in ways their families had never bothered to provide. "Same time next week?" asked Helen, a widow whose daughter had been managing her finances while systematically stealing her inheritance. "Absolutely," I said. "And next week we're making soup." As I drove home that evening, past the expensive neighborhoods where Nathan and Tanya lived their carefully curated life, I felt something I hadn't experienced in years: purpose. Not the exhausting obligation to meet other people's needs, but the deep satisfaction of using my skills to make a genuine difference in the world. I was no longer just surviving my life, I was finally living it. 6 months after that first cooking class, I stood before a room filled with 40 women, their faces reflecting the same mixture of pain and hope I'd once seen in my own mirror. The community center had expanded our program 3 times to accommodate the growing demand, and what had started as simple cooking lessons had evolved into something much more powerful: a sisterhood of survival. Cooking, I told the newest group of women, isn't just about feeding our bodies. It's about reclaiming our power to nurture ourselves and others on our own terms. In the back row, I spotted a familiar face: Tanya's mother, Helen, whom I'd known peripherally through family gatherings years ago. She looked smaller than I remembered, her usual confident posture replaced by the defeated slouch I recognized from my own dark days. When the class ended, she approached hesitantly. "Margaret," she said, her voice barely above a whisper, "I didn't know if you'd remember me." "Of course I remember you, Helen. How are you?" Her eyes filled with tears. "Not well. Tanya's been managing my finances since Robert died last year. I just discovered she's been using my money to pay for renovations on their house. When I questioned her about it, she told me I was getting confused, that I'd agreed to help with family expenses. The cruel irony wasn't lost on me. Tanya, who'd supported Nathan's systematic theft from me, had learned the techniques well enough to employ them against her own mother. The cycle of abuse had simply found a new victim. "Helen," I said gently, "would you like to stay after class next week? I know someone who can help." Dorothy, now in her 70s but still sharp as the legal mind she'd always been, had become our unofficial advocate, helping class members navigate the complex process of reclaiming their stolen independence. Within a month, Helen had recovered her money and severed Tanya's access to her accounts. More importantly, she'd found her voice again. The local newspaper ran a feature story about our program, titled "Rising from the Ashes: How Stolen Dignity Becomes Shared Strength." The article included photos of our Thursday evening sessions, women of all backgrounds standing together in the community center kitchen, flour on their aprons and laughter in their eyes. The reporter had captured something I'd struggled to articulate. We weren't just teaching cooking skills, we were rebuilding souls. The story caught the attention of the state legislature, which was considering new laws to strengthen protections for elderly citizens against financial abuse. I was invited to testify before the committee, sharing my experience as an example of how easily the system could be manipulated by family members with access and opportunity. Standing before those legislators, I felt the full weight of how far I'd traveled from the woman who'd once sat silent while her son forbade her to use her own kitchen. Financial elder abuse, I told them, isn't just about money. It's about stealing someone's identity, their autonomy, their basic human dignity. When you take away an elderly person's right to make their own decisions, you're not protecting them. You're erasing them. The law passed unanimously, establishing new safeguards for joint accounts and requiring additional documentation for guardianship petitions. The Margaret Morrison Act, they called it, though I would have preferred something less personally identifying. Still, knowing that other families might be spared what mine had endured gave me a sense of purpose I'd never imagined possible. On a crisp October morning, almost a year after the court hearing that changed my life, I was working in my garden when a small voice called out from my back gate. "Grandma?" I looked up to see Emma standing there, 10 years old now and looking so much like her father at that age that my heart clenched. She was alone, her school backpack still on her shoulders, her expression uncertain but determined. "Emma? Sweetheart, what are you doing here?" "I walked from school," she said, her chin jutting out with the stubborn independence I recognized from my own reflection. "I wanted to see you." My first instinct was to call Nathan, to follow the proper channels and avoid any violation of the restraining order that might complicate my hard-won freedom. But looking at my granddaughter's face, I realized that some things mattered more than legal technicalities. "Come in," I said, opening the gate. "Let's call your parents and let them know where you are." She nodded, but I could see the relief in her eyes that I hadn't sent her away immediately. Inside my kitchen, the room that had once been declared too dangerous for me to use, Emma sat at the table where I'd planned so many meals for her family, where I'd discovered the truth about my stolen money, where I'd made the decision to fight back. "I've missed you, Grandma," she said, her voice small but steady. "I know Daddy says we can't see you, but I don't understand why. You seem exactly the same to me." "I am the same," I said, filling the kettle for tea. "But sometimes grown-ups have disagreements that make things complicated." "Is it because you're sick? Daddy said you were sick in your brain?" The casual cruelty of it took my breath away. Nathan had poisoned his daughter's understanding of her grandmother, planting seeds of doubt and fear that might last her entire lifetime. "Emma," I said carefully, "I'm not sick. I never was sick. Your daddy and I had a disagreement about money and decisions, and sometimes when people disagree, they stop talking to each other for a while." She nodded with the grave seriousness of a child trying to make sense of adult failures. "Will you ever talk to him again?" "I don't know, sweetheart. But whatever happens between your daddy and me, I want you to know that I love you and Michael more than anything in this world. That will never change." We spent an hour together before I called Nathan's office. Emma helped me bake cookies, chocolate chip, her favorite, and told me about school, her friends, her hopes of trying out for the soccer team next year. For 60 precious minutes, I was simply a grandmother spending time with her granddaughter, the way it should have been all along. When Nathan arrived to collect her, his face was a mask of barely controlled fury. But he was smart enough not to violate the restraining order by entering my property, waiting instead at the curb while Emma gathered her backpack and the container of cookies I'd packed for her. "Goodbye, Grandma," she said, hugging me with fierce intensity. "I'm glad you're not sick. Goodbye, my darling. I love you." I watched from my doorway as Nathan helped her into his expensive car, their brief conversation too distant for me to hear. But as they drove away, Emma pressed her face to the rear window and waved, her small hand a reminder of everything I'd lost and everything I'd gained. That evening, Dorothy called with news that would close another chapter of this long, painful story. Nathan pled guilty to financial elder abuse, she reported. 5 years probation, full restitution of the remaining funds, and mandatory community service at an elder care facility. The judge said she wanted him to understand the vulnerability of the population he'd victimized. And Tanya? No charges filed against her, though her mother's case is proceeding separately. Apparently, Nathan's arrest was something of a wake-up call for their social circle. Several of their friends are now asking uncomfortable questions about their own elderly relatives' financial arrangements. I felt a complex mixture of satisfaction and sadness. Justice had been served, but at the cost of relationships that had once meant everything to me. Nathan was my son. Despite everything he'd done, part of me would always love the boy he'd been, even as I recognized the man he'd become. 2 years later, I received an unexpected letter. The return address was Nathan's, but the handwriting was unfamiliar. Careful, deliberate script that suggested great thought had gone into every word. "Mom," it began, "I know I have no right to contact you, and I'll understand if you don't read this. But I wanted you to know that I've been getting help. Therapy, mostly. Trying to understand how I became someone who could hurt the person who sacrificed everything for me. I don't expect forgiveness. I don't deserve it. But I want you to know that I finally understand what I did to you. Not just the money. That was the smallest part of it. I stole your dignity, your autonomy, your basic right to be treated as a competent adult. I convinced myself I was protecting you when I was really just making my own life more convenient. Emma asks about you constantly. She's 14 now, and she's fierce and independent, and reminds me every day of the woman I tried to diminish. She knows what I did was wrong, and she's made it clear that when she turns 18, she plans to have a relationship with you regardless of what I think about it. I don't know if there's any way back from where I am, but I wanted you to know that your strength in fighting back didn't just save you. It opened my eyes to who I'd become, the cooking classes you teach, the women you help, the law that bears your name. You've taken the worst thing that happened to you and turned it into hope for others. I love you, Mom. I always have, even when I was too selfish and entitled to show it properly. You deserved so much better than the son I was, but I'm trying to become the man you raised me to be. Your son, Nathan." I read the letter 3 times, then set it aside and went to my kitchen. It was Thursday evening, which meant 26 women would be arriving soon for our weekly class. Tonight we were making lasagna, a dish that required patience, attention to detail, and the willingness to layer ingredients slowly until they created something beautiful and nourishing. As I tied my apron around my waist, the same blue one that had once symbolized my diminished worth and now represented my reclaimed power, I thought about forgiveness and redemption, about the difference between love and enabling, about the complex courage required to rebuild a life from the ashes of betrayal. The women began arriving as the sun set, their voices filling my second home with warmth and purpose. These were my sisters now, bound together not by blood, but by the shared understanding of what it meant to be underestimated, discarded, and ultimately reborn. We were no longer just surviving. We were thriving. We were teaching each other that dignity couldn't be stolen if you refused to surrender it, that competence couldn't be questioned if you demonstrated it daily, that love wasn't something you had to purchase with compliance and silence. In the end, that was the most important lesson I'd learned. You can't buy love, but you can't lose it either, not if it's real. The love Nathan claimed to feel for me had been conditional, transactional, built on what I could provide rather than who I was. But the love I felt for these women, for the community we'd built, for the version of myself I'd finally allowed to emerge, that was unconditional, unshakable, eternal. As we gathered around the prep stations to begin our lesson, I looked at these incredible women and realized something profound. We hadn't just reclaimed our kitchens, we'd reclaimed ourselves. Have you ever felt like your worth was measured only by what you could give others, never by who you truly are inside? Have you watched someone you love treat you like a burden instead of a blessing? Share your story in the comments below. Your experience might be exactly what someone else needs to hear today. If this message touched your heart, please leave a like and subscribe to this channel. Together, we can make sure these important truths reach every person who needs to remember their own worth. Because everyone deserves to know, you are not too old to start over. You are not too set in your ways to fight back. And you are never, ever, too anything to matter.